Welcome to the Dirty Side of Leadership podcast with Ron and Kristin, where leadership meets entertainment. This podcast features stories with names and certain aspects that have been changed to keep submissions private. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Dirty Side of Leadership podcast, where leadership meets entertainment. Ron and I want to thank you all for your ongoing support. It means so much to us. And we wanted to cover a topic that's talked about, but not often talked about, if you know what I'm saying. After a number of listeners reached out to us asking us to cover this. And you know us, we will take on any topic. So in this episode, we are going to discuss the many layers of sexual harassment. Not only the who and the what, but the why. The who and the what is always discussed, but we're going to really dive deep into the why. And before we begin, if you are currently suffering from sexual harassment or have been a victim of this terrible act in the past, we encourage you to seek professional help. And a warning that we will be discussing instances of sexual harassment. So if you need to catch us next week, it's perfectly fine. We understand.
Yes. Kristin, before we get into this interesting topic, our meme of the week was provided by actually a friend of mine, Richard Thomas. He actually sends me memes probably almost daily, but and a lot of them stood out, but I picked this one. But I wanted to let our audience know that Richard Thomas also has a book on Amazon titled Mindset of a Champion. Here's the meme. Don't downgrade your dream to match your reality. Upgrade your faith to match your destiny.
I like it.
And I do too. I think so many times we limit ourselves instead of exercising our faith and believing that we can do, ordinary people do extraordinary things. That's where the word extraordinary comes from. And I think that we have that capacity, Kristin, if we can use this type of a mindset that I am going to do something great. There is something on the inside of me that just needs to be watered, needs that oxygen, and it's going to be birthed because I believe it. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I love it. And the first thing that came to mind for me was my high school boyfriend dumped me because he knew that I had big hopes and dreams. And he said, basically, he didn't think that he would ever be able to give me the lifestyle that I wanted for my future. So I thought that was pretty wild, especially for being young high school students. But I think about that mindset, and it's so sad to be so young and to already sell yourself short.
No, that's very true. Yeah. All right. Now to our topic of today. We're going to delve into sexual harassment. We know that it's been around since the beginning of time, but way back we didn't have definitions. We certainly didn't have training. There wasn't laws that were codified. There wasn't many rules. So over the past several years, sexual harassment has gotten a lot of attention, particularly in Hollywood. The Me Too movement resulted after the case involving Harvey Weinstein, who sexually harassed and even sexually assaulted women who agreed to meet with him to discuss career opportunities. And we heard story after story of his MO. He would bring them up to his hotel room. If you're listening, don't go to the hotel room. That's one of the first things I would say. Yeah. But these people went along with it, and we saw the outcome. And Harvey now, of course, is going to rot the rest of his years in prison. But it's amazing how many years passed before anything was done. But currently, now we always say where leadership meets entertainment. So from the entertainment perspective, I was reading an article on Vince McMahon. He's the co-founder with his wife of WWE. That's the wrestling. And this Janelle Grant apparently worked for McMahon. And again, I say everyone's innocent to proven guilty, but this is what is alleged. And her story is that he basically took her under his wing, and she had lost both parents and apparently was dealing with bankruptcy from the parents' estate. So she's in a volatile time. He takes her under his wing and begins to tell her, he's going to take care of her. But then it turns into a sexual relationship. I don't know if that part was consensual, but in her mindset, I'm not sure that it could have been. But then he begins to share nude photos of her and then began to use her, what we would call traffic her, to other men as what she said, a sexual pawn to entice world-faming wrestling talent.
Mm.
So I guess we haven't learned a lot, right, Kristin, based on that?
Guess not. Goodness gracious.
But due to this case, and as Kristin said, we think things that you want to hear, we decided to look at this multi-layered issue. So we asked the question, is this just a cut and dry? Someone's harassed and they ultimately file a lawsuit or whatever, or is there more to it? So Kristin, I will ask you, there's some people who say the definition is one person wants to have sex with another person, but it's not reciprocal. Does that sum it up?
Well, not exactly. So that's an outcome, but let's look deeper. So sexual harassment is really not about sex. It's about power, aggression, and manipulation. It's basically an abuse of power problem. And I know there's many studies out there by reputable people that back that up. There's a professor out there of leadership and management, James Campbell, and he talks about that quite often. It's an abuse of power problem. Now, this definition looks a lot like the Harvey Weinstein and Vince McMahon, but it hasn't been work related, right? So I just watched the Netflix special on American Nightmare, and it's basically about a female who was kidnapped in the middle of the night and released 48 hours later. The police blamed her and her boyfriend until finally the perp was caught and evidence pointed to her kidnapping. And they basically based her story off the movie Gone Girl, and she was ridiculed for weeks and weeks, and the boyfriend harassed, right? And so it's not just limited to Hollywood. This plays out every day in workplaces across America and all over the world. So I want to look up a definition for you guys and share it with you. So according to the EEOC, the definition of workplace sexual harassment, in short, it's a type of illegal sex discrimination. So again, according to the EEOC, workplace sexual harassment includes unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature.
Interesting. So I want to do a disclaimer, add a caveat here. Folks, we are not trying to be, as they say, Debbie Downers here. A lot of people that I talk to explain that in today's culture, people work together and that's the only way you can meet someone. And I get that. That is a healthy mutual relationship. Now, people have to be careful about, the HR policies and having a loving relationship in the office, but we get it. That's how some people meet. So we don't want to, attack that. That's two adults consenting. We're talking about situations like Kristin talked about where it's unwelcomed. And usually what some of the HR stuff that I've read is it's repetitive. Like someone asks another person out and the person declines and they keep doing it over and over. That's when it becomes a problem.
Right.
So now that we have a definition, let's consider some data. And this came from Zippa. I combined those two. DAPA. This comes from Zippa.com. Most women between 54 and 81% reporting experiencing some level of sexual harassment at work. Despite this prevalence, between 58 and 72% of victims don't report instances of workplace sexual harassment. Workers in accommodation and food services account for 14% of harassment charges. This number increases in academia with 50% of female faculty and staff and between 20 and 50% of female students encountering sexual harassment. Workplace sexual harassment costs companies $2.6 billion in lost productivity and $0.9 billion in other costs. Half of the women, 50%, who were victims of sexual assault stated that it hurt their careers.
That's
now,
really interesting.
I know, it's very interesting. So, Kristin, It's maybe an odd question, but do men get sexually harassed?
Yeah, they do actually. But I'm curious, I want to ask you, Ron, why, when they say here that they've lost money, was it 2.6 billion in lost productivity? The lost productivity because it's being spent cultivating these unhealthy relationships, or do we have any idea where this loss in productivity is coming from?
Well, it's a subjective number for sure, but there's a lot, as we've said in the beginning, there's a lot of elements. Everything from additional training on the topic. There's situations where people have later said, I didn't work for weeks because I was traumatized. You've got that element. And of course, you can't be working while you're harassing. So those two don't go together. But then there's lawsuits. There's all kinds of things that happen also on the back end of that. So yeah, it costs companies a lot, and a lot of it is training. A lot of it is trying to change the culture, bringing in people to try to change the culture.
Yeah, no, that's pretty wild. And that was the thing that really stood out to me. So I appreciate you breaking that down. So back to, do men get sexually harassed? So the answer is yes. And a recent poll revealed that 10% of the men surveyed had been victims of sexual misconduct or sexual harassment at work. Besides that, 1 out of 5 complaints filed with the EEOC were actually from men. So that's going to be surprising for a lot of people. I know it is for me. A few years back, Chipotle Mexican Grill was sued by the EEOC on behalf of a 22-year-old male shift manager. It was alleged that his female manager had been propositioning him and groping him during every shift. So a so-called sex scoreboard had also been posted, which included information about staff members' sex lives. That same year, the EEOC also sued Gold Corral Restaurant in Charlotte. I think out here it's Golden Corral. I don't know if it's the same. Is it Golden Corral? So Golden Corral Restaurant, they're all over the place. This one was in Charlotte after a male assistant manager allegedly created a hostile work environment for a male dishwasher who had autism. According to the complaint, the assistant manager repeatedly requested oral sex and called the dishwasher a retard. I hate that word. I really do. But that is, quote unquote, what he did to him. And another one here, the Cheesecake Factory. These are big names here. Is also not immune to sexual harassment lawsuits filed by their workers. 6 male employees asserted that they had been sexually assaulted repeatedly by a group of male kitchen workers some time back. This happened in one of the restaurants, in one of Arizona restaurant locations, and the EEOC claimed that the victims had been dragged into a walk-in refrigerator where the sexual abuse took place. And although the company ended up denying the allegations, it settled for $345,000 for the 6 abused workers. That's insane. I didn't think it was 0, but I definitely didn't think it was that high for men.
And Kristin, we decided, only because this is not to marginalize the women, because we do know it's more prevalent that males harass females. Right. Also, males harass males, and occasionally females harass males. We don't want to marginalize that, but we knew that that's never talked about. And that's why we wanted to put that in this podcast.
Right.
Although the majority of reported sexual harassment cases center around men harassing women, there have been signs that things are beginning to change. Now, we want to get over into the corporate level here. As more women have earned higher rungs on the corporate ladder, the balance of power has started to shift a bit. Although this evolution is a step forward for the business world, there's a dark side. There have been increased reports of women harassing men in workplaces. A recent poll revealed that 10% of the men surveyed had been victims of sexual misconduct or sexual harassment at work. Besides that, we've already said 1 in 5 complainants were men. But think about this, Kristin. We are starting to see, as a matter of fact, as you know, I do work with the police, and a lot of my Instagram connections are chiefs of police and sheriffs. So I was going through that because I do some marketing with them. And this happened literally last night. I started going through and I thought, oh my gosh, this is the most female chiefs of police that I've ever seen.
Hmm.
So there's been this shift in male-female where females are now starting to dominate culture, law enforcement. And now we're starting to see, the weird thing is some of the same patterns that men engaged in, it seems the women at the top are engaging in. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm curious, what do you think companies can do to minimize the culture of sexual harassment in general?
Yeah, we are definitely going to look at that. One of the things that everyone already does is training. And, Kristin, I do, we don't boast a lot here, but I think we're professional trainers. And, I've had a lot of training on adult learning theory and how to curriculum development and so forth. And one of the problems is, and I, we did this with the government when I was teaching at a university. They did the same thing. I would either take an online class, or even if you had live training, they might give you a couple tabletops or ask some questions, but then they leave and people go right back to the same. Like if there's not something challenging you to change behavior, now you might get scared of a lawsuit and change a little bit of behavior, but generally speaking, people go right back into the same activities and the same behaviors. So I think part of it, and we'll talk about some more later, but part of it starts with training and how you do training. It needs to be a before, during, and after with any training program. You need to prepare people for it, whether it's materials, videos, whatever it is. Then you do the training, but then you follow up with people like 6 months and say, did you learn anything? And also companies have to have those confidential surveys. Many of the things that are reported are only reported because people could do it confidentially.
Right.
And that's a missing element because let's be honest, Kristin, and you and I talked before, and I told you of a situation that I knew. It was a restaurant and the manager had slept with numerous female servers. We're talking between ages of 18 and 20. It was speculated. And they're adults. From a legal standpoint, it was consensual. But people get in a position of power, and then, we'll talk about some reasons, but the females look up to that person, and then they engage in, sexual conduct. So we understand that. We understand it would be very difficult for one of those females to have come forward. But we're hoping through, as they say, it takes a village, through community and through learning and education, that not that the female won't have to, the culture will change to the point that it doesn't happen, or someone else, maybe who's a little older, maybe a little more mature, will begin to speak up. It takes courage to step in and go, no, this isn't right. Or maybe just a private conversation, let's say with one of the servers, to literally say, you don't want to do this. You will regret this later. And whether they want to say this or not, he's probably doing this with other people because, of course, when you're a predator, you know how to make the one person feel special. And that's exactly what happens. They would say, you're the most beautiful server of all of them. It turns out the same lines were used. So I think that's a starting point. We'll talk about some more things as we go into this, but we have to take a different approach of training. And then I do want to say one other thing is there should be regular reminders that if this happens, or reminding to people to report. It's almost like the whistleblower rule, like you will not be penalized if you report this. I think the biggest problem is small companies, not big companies. I think the biggest problem is the mom and pop shops, but we'll get into that.
Yeah, it's like that said, and I could see how that would be the case. We just went over 3 big lawsuits that happen to be quite large conglomerates. But I wanted to just point out that, in a restaurant, even just using that example, if the manager is sleeping with one of the waitresses, let's say, when you work as a waitress in a restaurant, I did in high school, there are some tables that turn faster and make more money than others. Or, there's going to be more desired locations throughout the restaurant. And so I could just see how that would play out. They're going to get the better shifts, the better tables. And that's just a really negative thing all around. Even just taking the sexual harassment piece out of it, just the favors that are going to be shown because of that relationship, well, that I would deem inappropriate unless they're magical and they can completely keep it professional. I don't see that very often.
Yeah, many of these things do turn out to be transactional, and I understand that. But you asked me things that companies can do. I want to add one
Yeah.
more, and that is, because of the Harvey Weinstein case, we saw he finally, got his day and is in prison now. That sent a chill through Hollywood. And I think it made people more prone to report it. And it probably helped people rethink, committing those types of offenses. I think any company, when that happens, and I'm not sure how you can publicize it, but people need to know we dealt with this in the harshest terms. We went after this person because we do not tolerate. When you say, it's one thing to say verbally, we have a zero tolerance, and then everyone knows it's happening and somebody gets a slap on the wrist. So somewhere you do have to set examples. And I think that would probably serve as a real eye opener if someone is terminated for that type of conduct.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense.
Now that we've addressed a new look at training and talked about some other factors, let's consider the drivers that allow sexual harassment, or let's look at a root cause of this terrible behavior in the workplace. This is when Kristin said we're going to look at the why. Why do people succumb to sexual harassments? Why do some people allow it to go to the next level, even up to sexual assault, or even if at that point in their mind it's consensual? It's still a power dynamic, and in most situations, it's not right. So let's do a deeper dive into that power dynamic. Kristin, what do you got?
Yeah. So in the workplace, power dynamics are commonly thought to be associated with individuals' seniority, age, or value to a business. So, for instance, a harasser might be in a position of power due to being the owner of a business or a valued customer of a business, a direct supervisor of a person harassed, or in a position to influence that person's future and career prospects. That one's absolutely huge. So, as noted in the Harvey Weinstein case, he held a position of power over actresses. So, in other words, a male to female dynamic. And I know we're going to read through a few issues that contribute to this.
Yeah, brace yourself, folks, because this is the part that you don't hear on the news.
Right.
So why does someone allow this to happen? Number one, and we have talked about some of the dynamics of this, but it's self-esteem issues.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, someone who's been molested is far more likely to be molested again. And you heard that. You mentioned American Nightmare. Remember the female, she'd got molested at age 12, again at age 19, and then here she ends up being the one kidnapped. No one can really understand that, but it happens over and over. Also, basically your self-esteem gets low where you just feel like I deserve this. I might as well just let this happen. So I think there are instances of sexual harassment where the person probably has been abused before. But there's other things, an overbearing father or mother, things that hurt people's self-esteem. So they become subordinate to the person they see with power. It doesn't have to be a manager. It can just be someone else, but it's someone that they see that's more powerful than them. And by the way, we're not talking about sexual assault here. There may be a male overpower.
Yeah, not physical power
a female
per se.
or yes.
Right.
We're talking about that mindset where it may even start off small. Some people, they just bait, they will just make a comment to see how someone reacts. And then they start to enhance their level of psychological power that they have over someone. And then it just gets worse and worse. The term grooming is used a lot in talking about pedophiles and stuff, but there's also a form of grooming in that situation with sexual harassment. So unless someone has the willpower, the fortitude to stop it immediately, like I'm not going to tolerate this. And unless they can do that, it's probably going to grow. It starts with the comments and then it grows. Right. And unfortunately, all over, I've had story after story of people telling me, like I talked to a female, she said, and this was in the medical field, they had a chart and they were seeing who could go the longest without having sex. And they were marking days on this chart.
Yikes.
very inappropriate. And basically she justified it, but said, well, no one on the outside knew what the chart was. I said, trust me, had there been a lawsuit, there would have been the doctor in charge would have had no hope of winning.
Right.
There would have been a huge amount of money.
That's crazy. So another thing that you may not think about is fear. So this is pretty common. People are afraid of the perp. They are afraid of losing their job, and they're afraid of how they will be perceived in the office moving forward. And this is a very difficult issue because fear will certainly keep people from taking affirmative steps to make the harassment stop. When we were sharing the numbers earlier about men that have been harassed, that's only the percentage of men that actually reported it, that actually raised their hand in this anonymous survey and said, yes, this has happened to me. There are so many more that will not, and there's plenty of women that will not either. And a lot of that is fear of what other people will think about them.
Kristin, that's so important. These are reported instances, and there's so many that are not. And one cannot help but think that men are more hesitant. We know they are in prison. Yeah. We've got the data on that.
Yeah,
that they don't report. So I'm sure that marries to the general population as well, and in the workplace. So people are hesitant to file that, and a lot of it is fear. Number 3, this is something that doesn't get talked about either. That is basic necessities. Some people are desperate. Now, we mentioned the Vince McMahon story. This Jeanette Grant, who was trafficked allegedly, who, Vince allegedly passed pictures and all this stuff of. She was in a dire situation. Her parents had died. This is what I read. And I mentioned, they were facing bankruptcy. So think about her situation. And then here you've got this strong man steps in and I'm going to take care of you. Your basic necessities. So there's people working minimum wage jobs that think I might as well give in or I could lose my job and I've got to eat. So there's an element sometimes we don't even think about, but there are people that legitimately, and maybe they're going to do better in long term, but they're living paycheck to paycheck and they need that money. So they give in.
Right. Yeah. And that's sad. You think of even like the Epstein cases, right? Generally, the women that were preyed upon had broken families, didn't have a lot of money, right? So, or had a history of abuse already. And so they were vulnerable and really fell right into the grooming.
Kristin, right. I'm not proud of this, but I can remember in college, I can remember guys going, hey, let's go find some girls with daddy issues. And that was, kind of a known fact that, we're looking for females who are more vulnerable or maybe didn't have a good relationship with their dad, all those things. So,
right. Yeah, there's like truth to, or there's a reason for that, right? And it's actually quite sad, but I've heard that before too.
Let me jump in one more time. I don't mean this boastful, but I've sat through so many sexual harassment trainings. I don't even know how many. I used to have to take it annually, and I told you I taught at a university for a long time. The stuff we're talking about was never mentioned. It was just never mentioned. Like no one ever talked about people with needing basic necessities or their self-esteem, and they always were doing this Huey level, like, it takes training to stop sexual harassment. Well, how about we get into the real world and try to develop some real solutions?
Exactly.
Anyway,
it's because it's not PC. The truth is not PC.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
All right. So another one here, acceptance. So the need to be accepted. This is closely related to low self-esteem. In this case, people really want to be accepted by their boss or their coworkers, and they believe they have to do anything or they will do anything to make the other person happy and feel accepted.
Kristin, do you remember recently there was a deputy sheriff? She's been abused so badly, I didn't even look up her name, but she was having sex with 4 different officers.
Yes.
In a couple different departments. Her husband chose to stay with her and they were made fun of. But I thought about that, like what could her mindset have been? She obviously wanted to be popular among these guys. I mean, it was so out of the norm. And when you see a picture of her, you just couldn't hardly believe it. But if I had to put her in a category, and I don't know her, but I'm saying I think there was something there, of course, self-esteem, but also to be accepted. She was the in chick with these guys, I would think. So
no pun intended.
Yeah. Oh God, Kristin, I apologize, everyone. Number 5, career benefits. Now, let's be honest. Going back to the Harvey Weinstein, it's horrible. Harvey Weinstein is he's the dirt of the earth. We all agree with that. But there was obviously some level of greed, some level of wanting to be a star that some people, not when this happened initially. I'm not saying that at all. You get caught off guard. You're naive. You don't know this guy's, this gross guy is going to come out with his bathrobe on and nothing under it. I'm talking about the repeated, where you would go back and visit again. There's more to it. There's a deeper layer of that. I'm not blaming anyone. I'm just saying there's more to that. Mm-hmm. And there are people who will do anything to get promoted in their career, to have a big name, or to get promoted on a job. It just happens. It's human nature, and it's a reality. Whew. That one was heavy, Kristin. That one's heavy.
It is. And it's so incredibly common.
So let's talk to people. You may know someone, you may be listening and you know someone's being sexually harassed. Maybe you are being sexually harassed. And we've already said, if you have been, you need to get treatment, and we're not belittling that at all. As a matter of fact, Kristin and I have great senses of humor. And there's certainly, as you know, if you've been listening to us, we joke about everything. And this is something, of course, we could have made tons of jokes. We don't want to do that outside of Kristin's one little joke, but
just one.
But we do feel for people who are in a situation. So we want to give you just a little bit. We always say we're solution minded. We've already talked about the culture, the training, and things that need to be done. People need to be made an example of. If you see something, say something, all of that. But one of the first things, and I think this happens all the time, is especially with younger people, they come out of college, they've never been in that environment before. Mm-hmm. And again, it's an insecurity, but it's probably because of a lack of experience. So if you're listening, you're getting ready to go into the job world, be ready. And I would say this particularly to females just because of the statistics, but also males as well. But I'm saying females need to be ready because it's a world that you've not been introduced to sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Everyone needs to get informed. What is the sexual harassment policy against sexual harassment and bullying and other things? We usually don't even think about that, or we just breeze through it, or we go to a mandatory class, but find out what it does mean. What can you do? Mm-hmm. But if it's happening to you, be specific. The more specific you have, now I'm not talking about if you're in danger, but if it's mild things happening and you've told someone to stop, you need to keep a record. Mm-hmm. You do need to ask them to stop if you possibly have the fortitude. I know that's not easy, but you do need to ask them to stop and document that you explained, I'm not going out with you, or I don't want to do this, or whatever. You do need to address it in some way, whether it's to the individual or going to your superiors. Maybe it's a senior staff member, something to get started. And of course, you got HR. There are instances, as you know, Chris, and I'm not always the biggest HR fan. I'm like Michael Scott.
Yeah,
but,
me neither.
But they can help, and they did help me in some situations like that. Definitely contact your superior if you can do that. But if it is your superior, again, that puts it in a different world. Mm-hmm. And if it isn't handled promptly and appropriate, and you don't have a lawsuit opportunity, you got to make a plan to get out of there. You're going to have to change jobs. We want to reiterate, if you went through abuse, get counseling, get spiritual help. A lot of people find great comfort in that. Mm-hmm. And if you are working there and you know what's going on, stand up. If you see something, say something. Final thoughts, Kristin?
Yeah, basically, you need to, if you're in charge and you're in a leadership position, you need to make sure you're cultivating an environment where it's absolutely zero tolerance. That's just how it has to be. And we think about, same thing with crime. If you have a zero tolerance environment and there's repercussions, you're going to have a lot lower instance ratio. So you need to do the same thing when it comes to sexual harassment. Preventing it is huge. And then also I would just say everyone, I think it's important that everyone really takes a look within and says, is there anything that I could do differently to ensure that I'm not looked at in a certain way, right? I think that's important, that we watch our body language. We have a whole episode on what our body language is saying and portraying. And I think that all of that really goes hand in hand.
Kristin, I'm glad you ended because I'm glad we brought that up. We have talked a lot about body language, but I'm telling you, I have met females, the way they carry themselves, and males as well. But I'm talking about for me, like there's males I know not to pick a fight with the way they carry themselves. I know there's women that don't go there. Like it's a presence about them, the way they carry themselves, the confidence, the eye contact.
Yeah.
And you just know that's not somebody, that's going to be easily sexually harassed. So I would tell people that mimic those people, pull your shoulders back, have confidence, speak up for yourself.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. There's so much. And I know that's a very sensitive topic, but, I was just with two of my friends, two other moms, and we were talking about how they were both saying people just come up to them and randomly just have full blown conversations with them, grocery stores, anywhere they're at in the public. I'm like, yeah, people don't really talk to me. Like if I initiate a conversation, that's one thing. But I do think you can put off this, like, don't mess with me presence type of deal. And I do think it does come from confidence, because confidence can be intimidating. So
That's
the more
exactly right.
confident you are, you're not going to have the people that are preying on vulnerable people. You're not going to end up being a target or a primary target.
If you want to DM Chris and I, if you've got a story, because we are building training programs and other things, and we may cover this topic again at some point, but always feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And also, thank you so much for following us, the downloads. In the near future, we're going to give you some statistical data. We're ranking pretty high, and I think we have a real chance of getting in that top 20 in the United States in this particular niche or genre. So we'll be letting you know those stats, but we are greatly appreciative of all of you that supports the podcast and lets us know. It makes us feel good. Chris and I always share those stories. We don't take that lightly.
Right.
It's very cool when we know that people are impacted by the podcast. So thank you.
Yeah. And I appreciate those who reached out and were vulnerable and asked us. It was obviously privately in DMs, but asked us to cover this topic, because it was over a dozen folks that felt like this needed to be covered. And, we have leaders who want to hear more about the topic, and folks that feel like they might be have been a victim at some point, right? So it's people all over the map that wanted us to do more on this, because they know they'll get a fresh, truthful take on
That's what we try to do.
Yep, exactly.
All right, everybody, be the leader you're meant to be.
We'll see you next week.
The Dirty Side of Leadership podcast is brought to you by Forward Operations. If you'd like to book Ron or Kristin for speaking events, training, or executive coaching, visit forwardoperations.com. Be the leader you're meant to be.